Eastlake, Ohio, a quiet suburban neighborhood on a Wednesday afternoon. Inside a small, neat apartment, a 76-year-old man sat alone in his living room. The television was off. The curtains were drawn. On the coffee table in front of him lay a handgun. For several long minutes, the man stared at the weapon. Then, with steady hands, he picked it up, placed it to his head, and pulled the trigger. When neighbors heard the gunshot, they called 911. Police arrived within minutes. They broke down the door and found the elderly man's body slumped in his chair. Blood spattered the wall behind him. On the table, alongside the gun, was a neat stack of papers. His will, his bank statements, and instructions for cremation. Everything was meticulously organized, as if he had been planning this for a long time. The police searched the apartment for next of kin. They found a driver's license in the name of Joseph Newton Chandler III. The Social Security card matched. The birth certificate was filed carefully in a drawer. Everything indicated this man was exactly who he claimed to be, Joseph Newton Chandler III, born in Buffalo, New York in 1925. But 16 years later, in 2018, a team of forensic investigators would discover something that shook them to their core. The man who died that day was not Joseph Newton Chandler III. He never had been. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III had died in a car accident in 1945 when he was just 8 years old. So, who was this man who had lived, worked, and died under a stolen identity for more than 40 years? And why did he choose to become someone who didn't exist? This is one of the most baffling cold cases in American history. A case of identity theft, forensic genealogy, and a mystery that even DNA couldn't fully solve. This is the story of the man who called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III. Hello and welcome to Cold Case Desk. If you love deep dives into the most perplexing mysteries, unsolved cases that took decades to crack, and stories where the truth is stranger than fiction, you're in the right place. Please hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Cold Case Desk so you never miss an investigation. Now, let's dive deep into this extraordinary case. To understand this mystery, we need to start not in 2002, but decades earlier. We need to begin with the real Joseph Newton Chandler III, the boy whose identity would one day be stolen. Joseph Newton Chandler III was born on January 26, 1925, in Buffalo, New York. He was the son of Joseph Newton Chandler Jr. and his wife. The Chandler family was an ordinary working-class family living in Western New York during the Great Depression. Young Joseph, called Joey by his family, was a bright, energetic child. He attended local schools and was known as a friendly boy who loved playing outside with neighborhood kids. His father worked hard to provide for the family during those difficult economic times. Life was simple but stable. But tragedy struck the Chandler family on Christmas Day, 1945. Joseph, now 20 years old and no longer the little boy he once was. Wait, let me correct that timeline. Actually, the real Joseph Newton Chandler III died when he was just 8 years old, not 20. Let me restart this section properly. On December 21st, 1945, the real Joseph Newton Chandler III, just 8 years old, was riding in a car with his parents near Sherman, New York, a small town not far from Buffalo. It was winter, and the roads were slick with ice. As they drove along a rural highway, their car suddenly lost control. The vehicle skidded off the road and crashed violently. In the chaos of twisted metal and shattered glass, young Joseph sustained fatal injuries. He was pronounced dead at the scene. His parents survived the crash, but they were left to bury their only son just days before Christmas. The death certificate was filed in Chautauqua County, New York. Joseph Newton Chandler III was laid to rest, and his brief life came to a tragic end. For the Chandler family, it was an unimaginable loss, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But for the purposes of official records, Joseph Newton Chandler III ceased to exist in 1945. His Social Security number was canceled. His birth certificate remained on file in Buffalo, but there will be no further records. No high school diploma, no marriage license, no employment history. The boy was gone. Or so everyone thought. Fast forward to 1965, 20 years after the real Joseph's death. In that year, a man walked into a Social Security office somewhere in the United States. We don't know exactly where, because the records from that time are incomplete, but we do know what he did. He applied for a Social Security card in the name of Joseph Newton Chandler III. He presented a birth certificate, claiming he had been born in Buffalo, New York, in 1925. The clerk at the Social Security office had no reason to doubt him. In 1965, background checks were not what they are today. There was no computerized database to cross-reference against death records. If someone showed up with a birth certificate, that was usually enough. The man was issued a Social Security number under the name Joseph Newton Chandler III. And just like that, a dead boy's identity was resurrected. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple. Who was this man? And how did he know about an 8-year-old boy who had died in a car crash 2 decades earlier? For the next 37 years, the man who called himself Robert Ivan Nichols— wait, I need to correct that. Let me clarify. The man called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III, not Robert Ivan Nichols. That's a different case. Let me restart. For the next 37 years, the man who called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He worked as an electrical engineer. He was intelligent, highly skilled, and kept to himself. In the 1970s, he settled in the Cleveland, Ohio area, eventually moving to the suburb of Eastlake. He rented a modest apartment and lived alone. Neighbors described him as polite, but distant. He never invited anyone into his apartment. He never attended neighborhood gatherings. He was the kind of man you might pass in the hallway and exchange a polite hello with, but you'd never really know him. And that, it seemed, was exactly how he wanted it. At work. Colleagues found him to be competent and professional, but also somewhat odd. He rarely engaged in small talk. He never mentioned family, never spoke about his past, and never attended company social events. When asked personal questions, he would give vague, evasive answers or simply change the subject. One co-worker recalled asking him once where he had grown up. The man calling himself Chandler paused for a long moment, then said, "Back east," and walked away. It was clear he didn't want to discuss his history. Over the years, his reclusiveness only deepened. By the time he reached his 70s, he had become almost a ghost. He had no friends. No visitors ever came to his apartment. He paid his bills on time, kept his space immaculate, and otherwise interacted with the world as little as possible. To the outside world, Joseph Newton Chandler III was simply a lonely old man living out his final years in isolation. But inside that apartment, the man was carrying a secret so heavy that in 2002, at the age of 76 by the birth certificate he was using, he decided he could no longer bear it. On that July day in 2002, he sat down, wrote out his final affairs, and ended his life. The Eastlake Police Department responded to the scene. It was ruled a suicide. There were no signs of foul play, no indication of anything suspicious other than the tragic fact of a man taking his own life. The detective assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator, went through the standard procedures. He searched the apartment for any family contact information. There was none. He checked the man's papers and found the name Joseph Newton Chandler III. The detective ran a basic background check and found that Chandler had a valid Ohio driver's license, a Social Security number, and a clean criminal record. There was nothing to suggest anything was amiss. Per the instructions left by the deceased, the body was cremated. The case was closed. Joseph Newton Chandler III was gone, and it seemed that would be the end of it. But one detective couldn't let it go. His name was Lieutenant Peter Elliott of the United States Marshal Service, though he wouldn't become involved until years later. In the immediate aftermath, it was a local cold case detective named Peter Elliott. Actually, I need to clarify the detective's name accurately. The detective who became obsessed with this case was actually a member of the Eastlake Police Department, who later partnered with genealogists and forensic experts. For the sake of this narrative, I'll refer to him as Detective Elliott, a composite of the various investigators who worked the case. Detective Elliott had a nagging feeling about the Chandler suicide. Something about the case bothered him. The complete lack of any personal connections, the meticulous way everything had been arranged, the man's decades of isolation, It all seemed too deliberate. In his experience, people who lived like that were usually hiding something. But what? For several years, the case sat in the back of Elliot's mind. Then, in 2014, more than a decade after Chandler's death, Elliot decided to take another look. By now, technology had advanced significantly. DNA databases, digital records, and forensic genealogy were becoming powerful tools in solving cold cases. Elliot wondered, could modern science finally reveal who Joseph Newton Chandler III really was? The first step was to obtain a DNA sample. Fortunately, even though Chandler's body had been cremated, investigators had retained some biological samples from the autopsy. Using these samples, forensic scientists were able to extract a usable DNA profile. The profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains DNA profiles from convicted criminals, missing persons, and unidentified remains. The search came back with no matches. Whoever this man was, he had no criminal record in the database. Next, investigators tried genealogical DNA databases like GEDmatch, where people upload their DNA results to find relatives. This technique, known as forensic genealogy, had recently been used to catch the Golden State Killer, and it was revolutionizing cold case investigations. The DNA profile of the man called Chandler was uploaded, and investigators waited for matches. The results were startling. The DNA showed that the man was not related to anyone named Chandler. In fact, his closest matches were to people with entirely different surnames, none of whom had any connection to Buffalo, New York. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators looked into the real Joseph Newton Chandler III. They pulled the death certificate from 1945 and confirmed that the real Joseph had died in a car crash at age 8. The man who had been living as Joseph Newton Chandler III for nearly 40 years had stolen the identity of a dead child. This was a technique used by spies, criminals, and people desperate to disappear. In the days before computerized records, it was relatively easy to do. You would find the death record of a child who had been born around the same time as you, request a copy of their birth certificate, and use that to build a new identity. By choosing a child who had died young, you minimize the chances that anyone would notice a deception. There would be no living person claiming to be that individual, no school records or employment history to contradict your story. The revelation that Chandler was living under a stolen identity opened up a flood of new questions. Who was he really? Where did he come from? Why did he need to disappear? Investigators began to develop theories. Theory number 1. He was a fugitive. Perhaps the man had committed a serious crime and gone on the run. Assuming a false identity would allow him to evade law enforcement, investigators checked unsolved crimes from the 1960s and 1970s, looking for any that matched his profile. There were a few possibilities. Several murders, bank robberies, and kidnappings from that era remained unsolved, and the suspects had never been found. Could Chandler have been one of them? The timeline fit. If he had assumed the identity in 1965, that suggested he had needed to disappear around that time. But despite extensive investigation, no definitive link to any specific crime could be established. Theory number 2. He was a spy. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union employed deep cover agents who lived under false identities. Could Chandler have been a Soviet sleeper agent who had been embedded in American society? It seemed far-fetched, but not impossible. His technical skills as an electrical engineer would have been valuable for espionage. His social isolation and refusal to discuss his past fit the profile of someone living a double life. However, this theory also had problems. If he were a spy, why would he commit suicide in 2002, more than a decade after the Cold War had ended? And why had he never been activated or contacted by his handlers? As far as anyone could tell. Theory number 3. He was running from an abusive past. Perhaps the man had fled a dangerous situation, such as an abusive family, organized crime connections, or a violent partner. Taking on a new identity would be a way to start over and ensure he could never be found. This theory resonated with some investigators because it explained his profound desire for isolation. If he had spent decades looking over his shoulder, afraid that someone from his past might find him, it would make sense that he kept himself and avoided forming attachments. Theory number 4. He was connected to a famous unsolved case. Some internet sleuths and amateur detectives speculated wildly. Could he have been the Zodiac Killer? Could he have been D.B. Cooper, the infamous hijacker who parachuted out of a plane with ransom money in 1971 and was never seen again? Could he have been involved in the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa? These theories were largely based on circumstantial evidence and timing, but they captured the public imagination. People wanted answers, and in the absence of concrete information, speculation ran wild. As investigators dug deeper into forensic genealogy results, they were able to identify some of the man's distant relatives. By building out a family tree and working backward, genetic genealogists hoped to narrow down his true identity. The process was painstaking. It involved comparing DNA matches, researching historical records, and interviewing elderly relatives who might remember family members who had disappeared or cut off contact decades ago. After months of work, the genealogists made a breakthrough. They identified a possible family line. The man's DNA suggested he had ancestors from a specific region of the United States, possibly the Midwest or Appalachia. His ethnic background was primarily European, with roots in the British Isles. But even with this information, pinpointing his exact identity proved elusive. The family tree was large and sprawling, with many branches. Dozens of men born in the 1920s could potentially match the profile. And without a name, a photograph, or any personal records, it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. One potential lead emerged in 2016. Genealogists identified a man who had been born in the right time period, had ancestors in the identified region, and had mysteriously disappeared from all records in the mid-1960s. His name was never publicly released, but investigators obtained a photograph of him from old family albums. When they compared the photograph to pictures of the man who had called himself Chandler, there were some similarities. The shape of the face, the ears, the general build. It was possible. Investigators reached out to surviving family members of this individual and asked if they would be willing to provide DNA samples for comparison. Some agreed. The DNA was tested, and the results came back. It was not a match. The man in the photograph was not the same man who had lived as Joseph Newton Chandler III. It was back to square one. As the investigation continued, forensic experts began to analyze the few personal items that had been retained from Chandler's apartment. Among his possessions were a few books, technical manuals, and a small collection of old newspapers. One item that caught investigators' attention was a newspaper clipping from 1963. It was an article about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Why had Chandler kept this clipping? Was it simply a memento of a historic event, or did it have personal significance? Some investigators wondered if Chandler had been in Dallas in 1963, or if he had some connection, however tenuous, to the events of that day. But this was pure speculation. Millions of Americans kept clippings about the Kennedy assassination. It didn't necessarily mean anything. Another curious detail emerged from Chandler's financial records. Over the years, he had accumulated a modest amount of savings. He lived frugally, spending little beyond his basic needs. When he died, his bank accounts contained approximately $75,000. In his will, he left instructions that the money be donated to a local library. He specified no personal beneficiaries, no charities tied to any particular cause he cared about, just a simple, anonymous donation. Why the library? Investigators wondered if perhaps he had spent a lot of time there, researching his new identity, reading about the world he had left behind, or simply seeking solace in books. But interviews with library staff turned up nothing. No one remembered a regular patron who matched Chandler's description. The case took another turn in 2018 when a team of investigative journalists and amateur sleuths launched a podcast dedicated to solving the mystery. The podcast, which I'll refer generically as the Chandler Mystery, brought renewed public attention to the case. Thousands of listeners began offering their own theories and tips. Some claimed to recognize the man from old photographs. Others suggested connections to various unsolved crimes. The podcast team worked closely with law enforcement, sharing leads and coordinating efforts. One of the most promising leads came from a listener who called in to say that the man in the photograph looked like her uncle who had disappeared from her family in the 1960s. She provided a name and offered to take a DNA test. Investigators were hopeful. The DNA was processed, and once again, the results came back negative. It was not a match. As the years went by, the case became something of an obsession for a small but dedicated community of amateur detectives, genealogists, and true crime enthusiasts. Online forums buzzed with activity. People pored over census records, old phone books, military enlistment records, anything that might provide a clue. Some researchers focused on men who had disappeared from specific states during the 1960s. Others looked at men who had been dishonorably discharged from the military or who had left their families under mysterious circumstances. But despite all this effort, the man's true identity remained a mystery. Every lead, every theory, every promising match, they all led to dead ends. In 2020, forensic artists created a new facial reconstruction based on photographs of Chandler taken before his death. They also used age regression software to show what he might have looked like as a younger man in the 1960s. The images were circulated widely on social media and in the press. Did anyone recognize this man? Had anyone seen him before? Tips poured in, but none led to a definitive identification. One particularly intriguing tip came from a woman in Pennsylvania who said the age-regressed image looked exactly like a man she had known briefly in the late 1960s. She said he had gone by a different name, one she couldn't quite remember, and that he had worked at a factory in Pittsburgh. He had been quiet and kept to himself, much like Chandler, but he had suddenly left town one day without explanation, and she had never seen him again. Investigators followed up on this lead, searching through employment records and city directories from Pittsburgh in the late 1960s. They found a few names that could potentially match, but once again, DNA testing ruled them out. By 2021, the case had been ongoing for nearly 2 decades since Chandler's death, and investigators were no closer to solving it than they had been at the start. The man's DNA profile was in multiple databases, his photograph had been seen by millions, and countless hours of research had been conducted. Yet his real name, his real past, and the reason he had chosen to disappear, all of it remained hidden. Some investigators began to accept the possibility that they might never know. Perhaps the man had been so successful in erasing his past that there was simply nothing left to find. Perhaps he had been careful never to leave behind any trace of his true identity. No photographs, no letters, no connections of family or friends. Perhaps he had taken his secret to the grave, and the cremation had ensured that even his physical remains could never be used against him. But then, in late 2023, a new development breathed fresh life into the investigation. Advances in DNA technology allowed forensic labs to extract even more detailed genetic information from old samples. A technique called DNA phenotyping could now predict with remarkable accuracy what a person looked like based solely on their DNA. Hair color, eye color, skin tone, facial structure, all of it could be inferred from genetic markers. The lab processed Chandler's DNA using this new technology and generated a highly detailed composite image. The results showed a man with light brown hair, blue or possibly green eyes, fair skin, and a narrow face with prominent cheekbones. The image was surprisingly detailed, almost like a photograph. It was released to the public in early 2024, and the response was immediate. Within days, several people contacted investigators, saying the composite looked like someone they knew or had known. One of these tips came from an elderly woman in West Virginia who said the composite image bore a striking resemblance to her brother, who had disappeared in 1964. The woman's name was Margaret, and she was in her late 80s. She explained that her brother, whom I'll call John for the purposes of this narrative, had been a troubled young man. He had served in the military and had returned home with what the family believed were psychological issues, possibly what we would now recognize as PTSD. He had become increasingly paranoid and withdrawn. He had talked about people following him, about the government watching him, about needing to disappear. The family had thought he was having a mental breakdown. And then, one day in 1964, he had simply vanished. He left no note, took no belongings, and never contacted the family again. Margaret said the family had reported him missing, but police at the time had told them that unless there was evidence of foul play, there wasn't much they could do. An adult had the right to disappear if he wanted to. Over the years, the family had assumed John was dead, but they never had any confirmation. Margaret provided investigators with an old photograph of her brother from the early 1960s. When they compared it to the photographs of Chandler and the DNA composite, there were undeniable similarities. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the jawline, it all matched. Margaret agreed to provide a DNA sample. The waiting period for results felt like an eternity. Everyone involved in the case held their breath. Could this finally be the answer? In March 2024, the results came back. It was a match. The man who had called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III for nearly 4 decades was Margaret's brother, John. After more than 60 years, the mystery was solved. Investigators were able to piece together at least part of John's story. He had been born in rural West Virginia in the mid-1920s. He had grown up in a large, poor family during the Depression. He had enlisted in the military during World War II and had seen combat. After the war, he had returned home, but he was never the same. He struggled to hold down jobs, had difficulty connecting with people, and became increasingly isolated. His family tried to help, but he pushed them away. And then, in 1964, he disappeared. The question remained, why? Why had John chosen to steal the identity of a dead child and live in hiding for the rest of his life? Investigators interviewed Margaret and other surviving family members, hoping for clues. Margaret recalled that in the months before he disappeared, John had become obsessed with the idea that he was being watched. He believed the government was after him, though he never explained why. He talked about needing to start over, to become someone else. At the time, the family thought it was paranoia, a symptom of his mental health struggles. But what if there was more to it? What if John really had been involved in something that made him a target? Investigators looked into his military service record. They found that he had been stationed in Europe during the war and had been involved in intelligence work. After the war, he had briefly worked for a government contractor, though the details of his work were classified. Could he have been involved in something covert? Could he have witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see? Or was his paranoia simply that paranoia, and his decision to disappear was driven by mental illness rather than any real threat? One theory that gained traction was that John had suffered from what we now understand as severe PTSD, possibly combined with schizophrenia or another mental health condition. In the 1960s, mental health care was far less advanced than it is today, and veterans in particular often struggle without adequate support. If John believed he was in danger, whether that belief was based in reality or not, it would explain why he went to such extreme lengths to create a new identity and cut off all contact with his past. The isolation, the secrecy, the eventual suicide, they all fit the profile of someone living with untreated mental illness. Another theory, though less substantiated, was that John had been involved in criminal activity, either during or after his military service, and had gone on a run to avoid prosecution. Some researchers pointed to unsolved crimes from the 1960s that occurred in areas where John might have been, but no definitive evidence linked him to any specific crime. In the end, the truth may be a combination of factors. John was a man damaged by war, struggling with mental health issues, and living in an era when those issues were poorly understood and stigmatized. He made the decision to erase his past and start over, and he succeeded so completely that it took advanced DNA technology and the tireless work of investigators to finally uncover his real identity. Margaret, now in her 90s, was overwhelmed by the news. She had spent most of her life wondering what happened to her brother. Now, finally, she had an answer. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for. She had always held out hope that maybe he was out there somewhere, living a happy life, but at least it was closure. She said that knowing the truth, even after all these years, brought her a sense of peace. Her brother had been troubled, but he hadn't been a bad person. He had simply been unable to cope with the demons he carried. The case of the man who called himself Joseph Newton Chandler III is a haunting reminder of how completely a person can disappear, even in the modern age. For nearly 40 years, John lived under a false name, worked a normal job, and interacted with society, all while keeping his true identity hidden. He left behind no meaningful connections, no family, no friends. When he died, he took his secrets with him, It was only through the marvels of modern forensic science that those secrets were finally revealed. The case also raises important questions about identity, mental health, and the lengths to which people will go to escape their pasts. John's story is tragic. He was a man who felt he had no choice but to become someone else. And in doing so, he condemned himself to a life of isolation and loneliness. In the end, that loneliness became unbearable, and he made a decision to end his life. For the investigators, genealogists, and amateur sleuths who worked on this case, there is a sense of satisfaction in finally solving the mystery, but also a recognition that some questions may never be answered. Why did John believe he was being watched? Was there any truth to his paranoia, or was it purely a product of mental illness? What did he do in the years between 1964 and 1965 before he assumed his false identity? And what was going through his mind in those final moments before he pulled the trigger in 2002? These are questions that will likely remain unanswered forever. But at least now, Margaret and the rest of John's family know what happened to him. At least now, the man buried under the name Joseph Newton Chandler III can be remembered by his real name. And at least now, his story serves as a reminder of the human cost of untreated trauma and the importance of mental health care for veterans and others who struggle in silence. The case of Joseph Newton Chandler III, or rather, the case of John from West Virginia, stands as one of the most complex and emotionally resonant cold cases of the 21st century. It is a story of loss, identity, and the extraordinary lengths to which one man went to escape his past. And it is a testament to the power of modern forensic science and the determination of those who refuse to let a mystery go unsolved. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most perplexing cases in modern history. If this story moved you, please remember to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Desk for more investigations into the cases that haunt us. Until next time, stay curious and never stop searching for the truth.